By bringing developers and security together, you don't have to choose between speed and security. Develop fast, stay secure.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Cloud Security Podcast for Kubernetes Security Month. And today we're talking about policy management. I think this is probably an important topic also from a perspective that a lot of people have been talking and asking for. Hey, how do we manage things across cluster? What do we do for policies? I have an information security policy. So we have someone special here to kind of talk about this as well. So before I bring him on, let me just play some music as well for the choice of music. Hello. Hey, Jim. How are you?
Hey Ashish, pleasure being here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you for coming in. I've got a few people coming online as well. Hey, Vinny, thanks for coming in, man. Good morning. So, for people who may not know who Jim is, if you can probably start with just a brief intro about who you are and where you are these days and how you got to where you are today, that'll be awesome, man.
Absolutely. Yes, I'm Jim Bugwadia, co-founder at Nirmata, as well as a maintainer on Kyverno, which is a policy engine we created for Kubernetes. So just going back a bit in terms of my path to where we are today. So I'm a software developer, still pretty active, both on open source as well as some of our other products. My path, I guess, starting out after I got my grad school degree back at the University of Illinois in Chicago. I started in the telecommunications network management space. So to me, what was always fascinating is how software gets applied and how it transforms our daily lives, right? And perhaps the most complex domain I could find at that time was telephony, and seeing it's mission critical. It's almost you need it for life. We all take it for granted, but there's a lot of complex software that does make that works together to make all of that happen. And that's where we learned about large scale distributed systems, building these type of global networks, and managing software at scale.
Nice.
So yeah, I guess after that, I moved to Silicon Valley, San Jose, where I currently reside in about 99, worked at a number of different startups, and eventually ended up founding Nirmata, in 2013 with my co-founders, Ritesh and Damien.
Awesome. And to your point, then, with the Kyverno being the CNCF project for free, for free, it is free for policy management in the
Yep.
Kubernetes space. I wanted to start with the foundational pieces. I think it's usually always helpful because we get a mix of people who may be new to Kubernetes but trying to learn it, but we also have people who are probably quite veteran in the space as well. How do you define Kubernetes control plane?
Yeah, great question, right? So going back again to my days in the telecom space, if you look at any complex system, there's a layered architecture model that telecommunications introduced, which got adopted by networking as well as now, of course, with Kubernetes and distributed systems. So you have your management plane, which is kind of like the top level, and it coordinates, manages, configures, does fault, observability, things like that across your entire system.
Yep.
Then you have your control plane, which in telephony is used for signaling as well as protocol management. For us today, it's more like keeping in the Kubernetes world, it's schedulers, right? So if you think about how Kubernetes works, everything is a control loop. You declare your desired state and configuration, and the controllers make that happen. Like they place a pod, they will make sure that your application is self-healing. Even for other add-ons as custom resources, it's the same idea. You would write controllers for that. So all these controllers run in the control plane. And then finally, you have a data plane, which is where your applications and the communication, the data for your system resides. Now, the
Yeah.
whole idea is decoupling these planes and making the system highly reliable, highly, self-healing and fault tolerant itself.
Right. Talking about controllers, another word that keeps coming up with Kubernetes is admission controller. What is that?
Right. Yeah, so Kubernetes, as a modern system, everything goes through API calls, right? So
Yeah.
most distributed modern systems are API first. And in Kubernetes, any operation that you want to do, whether it's through kubectl or other management tools, goes, it issues an API call. An API call goes through different phases like authentication and authorization. And then there's the next phase is admission controls. And what that means is Kubernetes, because it's designed to be pluggable, it's designed to solve a broad amount of use cases. You can have your own admission controllers which inspect every API request and
Hmm.
then can allow or deny that request or can trigger other automation and trigger other things based on that API request, right? So it's an extremely powerful building block which lets us do things like what Kyverno does for security and for automation, and it works seamlessly with the control plane components for Kubernetes.
Right, because I mean that kind of leads me into the whole policy management thing as well. If you have admission controller, why do you need a policy management? I guess.
Right. Yeah. So the thing is, so let's step back and think about what policies are, right?
Yeah.
And as a developer, if somebody comes, if like my, when I was working at larger companies, if my manager came to me and said, "Hey, let's apply policies," I'm like, "What are you talking about? I don't want to deal with this. Go away,"
Yeah,
right?
that's
Let me
pretty
do
much
my
it.
work, and I don't need more policies, right? But today, if you look at the cloud native way of doing policies, it's very different. And think about Kubernetes is the first, platform designed for DevSecOps. It
Hmm.
brings together these three roles, and these three roles need to collaborate on, on various aspects of the system. So how do you do that? Now, of course, you could have tickets and you could be on Slack trying to collaborate, which is great. You should do that, but at the same time, we need something better. We need something automated. The whole world has gone with, of course, in the last couple of years, distributed, and we want to be async in our communication. So what better way than expressing policies as a digital contract, policy as
Hmm.
code, make sure it's something that we manage just like we manage our apps or other software assets, and allowing these different roles to collaborate on it. So the whole idea is policies differ dramatically based on the organization, based on the compliance requirements. There are some standards, of course, which all of us should be applying for any Kubernetes cluster, right? And it's a bit scary how many folks end up in production without thinking of this. So, like pod security standards, which are native to Kubernetes now, you definitely want to apply. But to be able to manage pod security even in a flexible manner, you need pluggable admission controllers, which let you customize the policies to your needs. And that's where projects like Kyverno and others come in to allow that policy definition and declaration, much like you can do with other resources in Kubernetes.
Oh, right. So wait, to your point, then port security, which I think was deprecated after beyond a certain point, right? Is that something that we would have been like the primitive version of policy management, where before Kyverno became open source project, what were people doing then?
Yeah. So there's still built-in policy constructs, right? So like
Right.
network policy is built in into Kubernetes. RBAC is built in into Kubernetes. Things like pod security policy, PSPs, were built in into Kubernetes. Now they're deprecated. There's something called pod security admission, which was its replacement. So those still exist. And that's
Yeah.
like a baseline you need to kind of understand and start, applying for your overall security posture and model. However, there's a lot more things that are required. Just let's take an example for pod security, right? So yes, you could enable pod security admission, which does namespace level pod security. But what if you need more granular controls? What if you want better reporting? What if you want, some way of sharing these pod security policies again as using policy as code? In those cases, now you would look at something like Kyverno, or other alternatives in the community, which will provide a better implementation of the pod security standards to provide more flexibility, etc. But keep in mind, pods are only the basic level, right? So
Yeah.
there's
Right.
workloads on top of pods like deployment, stateful sets, daemon sets. There's several other things like services. There's add-ons like Istio and or like Linkerd for service mesh. So the list goes on and on. So you also want to secure those. There's nothing native that Kubernetes provides for those configurations and to secure those, which is where a policy engine becomes super critical.
Wait, so is this the same when people go for like a managed Kubernetes as well? You know how the cloud service providers have their
Yeah.
version as well? Maybe bare metal Kubernetes doesn't allow that. How does this work in like a managed Kubernetes context?
Yeah, great question, right? And there's this notion that because you go to, let's say a cloud provider and get a managed Kubernetes, they have to be thinking about security, right? And they
Yeah,
do, right? They do the best they can. But in every cloud provider kind of will show you their shared security model, right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
in that shared security model, guess what? You're responsible for securing Kubernetes. They are giving you the control plane components, but any workload, any pod that runs in there, that's the responsibility of the user. You cannot turn around and say, hey, somebody kind of had a container, our workload had a container escape, they exploited something. That's the user's responsibility. And Kubernetes is, insecure. Even with pod security admission, the default setting for pod security admission is privileged, which means you can run anything, right? And it's designed, to be easy to get started with, easy to use, because always this contention, as you very well know, between security and usability, right? So you
Yeah.
want people to adopt projects, you want them to get, and if you make it too restricted from the beginning, it just there's too many hurdles to get started. So okay, so you lean towards that usability, but you really, as a platform team, or as anybody responsible for production Kubernetes, you have to understand that shared security model, even with managed service providers, or if you're using vanilla Kubernetes, the same applies.
Right. And okay, so we've still shared the shared responsibility model path with that we can take down the path of. So to your point, then if there is no option, like from a pod security perspective, Kubernetes doesn't provide out of the box anything. We kind of go down the path of Kyverno or any of the other OPA or whatever else that
Yep.
kind of comes are being released by people. At that point in time, I imagine in my mind, so that's just one cluster. But most organizations these have
Right.
multiple clusters as well.
Yeah.
How does this kind of scale to that level?
Yeah, no, great question, right? So one minor, kind of thing to point out though. So Kubernetes does provide pod security admission built in, right?
Right.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's good to enable that. Kyverno, our kind of position on that is yes, use pod security admission and use Kyverno to complement and to manage that in a more flexible manner, right? So
Right.
that's
Right.
that gives you the best security posture.
Yeah.
Um, so but to your point, how do you manage at scale, right? And today if you kind of look at, enterprises are running, there was a case study from like Mercedes Benz or somebody, they're talking about 800 clusters, right? But it
Yeah.
sounds
Yeah.
like that's a lot right? And
Well, yeah. Yeah.
imagine managing 800 production clusters, deploying things, version control, security, all of that.
With a
So,
two people team as well.
right, right. That's the other constraint, right?
Yeah.
So to pull that off, you have to adopt cloud native best practices like GitOps, right? Moving to everything as code, making sure all of your declarations for your cluster config. And today we have projects like Cluster API, which are just dramatically game changers for that, right? So through Cluster API and other things, you can now have Kubernetes manage other Kubernetes clusters. So it's like
Oh.
inception for Kubernetes, right? So you kind of have your Git repos, which are managing these declarative configurations. You use Cluster API to spin up and manage these other clusters, but you have to make sure, again, through policy as code, each one of those clusters is secured. You put the right policies there, but it's all driven through Git. It all starts with a pull request, right? Which is
Right.
a beautiful world.
Wait, that's awesome. So, but it's almost like who's watching the watcher, I guess, kind of thing. Then what's the who's thinking of the cluster API then?
Yeah, so or so one thing, cluster API, because it's Kubernetes native, you're kind of again using Kubernetes to manage clusters.
Yeah.
Kyverno integrates very well with that, right? So you can use Kyverno policies to watch cluster API resources, both for automation as well as security. And in fact, at GitOpsCon, I have a talk, with a product manager from Intuit, and we're going to talk about exactly this use case and how Kyverno can be used to secure and automate some of these cluster API functions. So yeah, pretty interesting, kind of spin on things. But to go back to the management at scale type of challenge, certainly adopting, we're seeing it's very interesting, right? So we work with very large enterprises, as from Nirmata, our company perspective, and as we see, them adopt Kubernetes, it's not just changing how they're managing applications; it's changing every IT process within their enterprise, right? They're moving to more using this Git and PR model for infrastructure provisioning, even for deploying VMs on top of Kubernetes, right? To say you want a new Windows desktop, guess what? Create a pull request. We don't need a ticketing system. We don't need any of that. And as long as you're using, in that case, of instead of cluster API, you would use a project called KubeVirt. It will spin up a virtual machine in Kubernetes. You assign it to the user, and everything's tracked through Git as the system of record. Kubernetes now becomes the new system of delivery.
What? Can you do that? I didn't realize you could do that with Kubernetes.
Absolutely, yeah,
It's like,
yeah,
so wait, so there would be a desktop that would be, I mean, I guess for lack of a better word, the VMware equivalent that
yeah.
from the back in the day where we had, oh, I need a virtual machine, Mr.
Correct.
Sysadmin or Mr. Admin, and that is being done by a pull request, and I
Yes.
would get a desktop.
Yes, you can get a Windows desktop running on Kubernetes. It's a VM in a container, but
Yeah.
to the end user, it looks like a VM.
What? And so, can you? I always thought that wasn't that like an anti-pattern to have like a really big image on like a port as well?
So there are some trade-offs, right? So
Oh,
yes,
like
you
that,
will
right?
get,
Fair enough. I mean, yeah, to your point, but
yeah.
what you're saying is it's possible to do that.
It's not only possible, but the cloud providers have been doing that for quite a while. So when you get, for their to maximize their, kind of revenues and margins, they are
Yeah,
running you when you get a VM, it's not running necessarily as a VM. It could be running as a container based on which cloud provider you go to.
yeah, that's right. I mean, I think apparently serverless is also all containers in the background, anyways, to begin
Yeah,
with. Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
So, we're definitely living in a world where containers probably the back end. It feels like, I mean, I guess the reason I was surprised was because your serverless functions are primarily just like, hey,
right,
a hello world or something small. I don't
right.
get like a workspace to work on using a container or Kubernetes
which
in the
is
background.
which is long lived, it's stateful. Yes, I
Yeah,
mean that those, because typically you say, well, containers are great for stateless short lived apps,
that's
but
right.
that's no longer the case, right? And what we are also like with projects like Crossplane, which is another CNCF project, that allows you to provision cloud resources. So you can use Kubernetes to spin up an S3 bucket, and you can use Kyverno to secure that, right? So you can have a policies that's saying all of my users or this team can only spin up S3 in this particular region. It has to be, encrypted. It has to be secure. You can have all those policies. So it's a completely different. It's a game changer.
Wow, that is a great game changer. I just want to quickly acknowledge someone who also came in as well. Hey, Donald. Good day, man. Thanks for coming in. So this is mind blowing for me. Maybe just so that I can level the playing field as well. What are some of the common use cases where people kind of think about policy management? Because I think
Yeah.
to what you mentioned, to scale port security and to scale across clusters and what your policy will look like. One of the obvious use cases that come to my mind is, oh, if I already have an information security policy, for our example, everything should be encrypted.
Yeah.
I can use a policy management engine to deploy
Absolutely.
that policy across Kubernetes. Is that the use case, or what are some of the examples you see of?
Yeah, that's a great example, right? So data protection, data encryption, those are very key use cases. So the,
Yeah,
the three categories, we usually advocate our customers to start with. The first is basic pod security, right? So make sure you're good with that. You understand how that's managed and how to do that at scale. And by the
yeah,
way, with every version of Kubernetes, pod security also changes, right? So it's not a static thing. You have to keep in mind you need to kind of keep up with those changes. You need to understand what that means for your workloads. When new CVEs come up, we are constantly like, creating policies to help with that as well. So that's the first level. The second level is workload security, where just like we talked about, it's not just about a pod, but it's like your services. making sure you're using encryption at rest, encryption in transit, things like that. And all of that is done through workload at that layer, right? So like your services, your deployments, your stateful sets, making sure your volumes have the right, kind of, again, configuration, etc. And then finally, there's a ton of best practices, right, which also have a key impact on security. So most deployments, most clusters are shared because
Mm.
Kubernetes at its guts is a bin packing scheduler. You to get the maximum value from Kubernetes, you want it to pack, applications on some subset of resources. So to be able to do that, how do you kind of come up with the right tenancy model? How do you come up with things like making sure that if somebody doesn't as a health check, and if their pod keeps spinning, it doesn't impact other applications on that same cluster. So for all of those, there's tons of best practices. So if you go to the Kyverno.io page, there's almost like 230 community-driven policies across these three categories, right? And then finally, like if you kind of want to go one level above, nowadays container image signing verification is critical. In fact, in the U.S., there's a federal mandate that anybody supplying software to the government has to provide SBOMs, has to start container image signing, verification, things like that. So that becomes a very key use case, right? So those four, I would say, are a good starting point. But
Yeah.
then as you bring in other things, if you're using Kubernetes, like we were talking about, for other things, you would want to look at security at those layers too.
Yeah, yeah. I think nowadays the conversation is not even considered complete if you don't mention SBOM three times at least. It's like SBOM, SBOM, SBOM. But I
Yeah.
think, yeah, to what you said, the chain of custody has become definitely quite important these days. Uh, if you have over 200 plus policies in from the community, is there like a, I don't know, like a top 10 or like an OWASP top 10 or top five that you normally recommend to people? Because I feel like it'll be overwhelming for people
It
who
is.
might be like
It
Donald
can
and
be.
Vineet and everyone else who's listening into this conversation. For them, they're like, well, that's great. 200 plus policies, but which one do I start with? So is there like a small
Yeah.
list that you normally recommend?
Yes. So these policies, so policies are a building block, right? They're the how you're doing things. So to kind
Yeah,
of start with, and what we do as well as other vendors in the space is you want to map these policies into categories and into, what do you want to achieve from an organizational level? So if, for
right.
example, let's say OWASP top 10 for Kubernetes is important, you can map these policies to a scorecard, and you can
Yeah,
say, okay, to implement this, here's what I need to do. And each policy or each of those standards may translate into multiple policies and controls, right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
when you have that mapping, then it becomes extremely powerful. In fact, in the community, I'm a co-chair of the policy working group, and that's where we're discussing this continuous compliance as code as the next level above policies, right? Because policies are not, nobody like wakes up and says, I want more policies today, right? Come on.
Well,
We
hope not. I mean,
Yeah.
they need something else in their life.
Right. So it's more like what does my organization need? How do I achieve that? And how do I push move my business forward, right?
Yeah,
So for that, compliance is extremely important. Achieving that, and whether it's the OWASP top 10, whether it's PCI, whether it's the NSA hardening guidelines, pick your standards, right? And we're seeing a lot of organizations starting to build internal standards to say,
yeah.
here's for secure Kubernetes, here's my enterprise standard, and I want to make sure every cluster is compliant. So if you kind of think of it from that perspective, you can, the policies, yes, there could be a lot, but you could put them in three or four categories, and that becomes a lot simpler from a mental model perspective, right?
Ah, right. I mean, it's kind of what people normally recommend for resolving vulnerabilities across an organization as well. You can't just solve all vulnerabilities like one, two, three, four. But what
Yeah,
you can do is, hey, let's look at all SQL injection, or let's look at all cross-site
correct.
scripting. Just pick a category and just go with that. Is that kind of sounds like very similar to what you're
Very
recommending?
much. Yeah, so let's take an example, right? You start with NIST 853, and maybe there's like some recommendation there that says everything must be encrypted. So you
Yeah.
can take that and you could say, okay, to for me to achieve that recommendation, here are the four policies that must, pass, right?
Mm.
And then you have, policy as code. So you're making sure. So how do you prove to an auditor every cluster has those policies? How do you make sure the policies are actually working, are doing what they're supposed to be,
Right.
and capture the results for those? And then how do you map that back to your standard that you started out with and say, okay, now I can tell Tuesday, October 5th, yes, this was my posture and this policy's passed. So I was compliant to the standard that I want to, recommend or mandate for my organization.
Right. And have you seen? I mean, I know you kind of co-chair the policy, uh, I guess, group that you were mentioning.
Yeah.
How do you see people do compliance in Kubernetes using policy management? Is that? I mean, I know I'm putting you on the spot for this, but is there an example, like to your point about the NIST framework? I
Right.
have four policies in there. Like, how do you even show that? So, would that be the GitOps flow that I say, oh, my pull request and everything kind of going through?
So that's the idea, right? So you want to even take that and policy management. And one of the reasons why Kyverno resonates so much in the community, in the Kubernetes community, is because it allows that GitOps workflow for policies, right? It's just policies are just a Kubernetes resource. Policy reports are standardized. By the way, the Kyverno reports are in a standard format, which the policy work group kind of chartered as well as promotes. And
Right.
there are, it's not just Kyverno reports, right? You could have reports from runtime engines like Falco as well as KubeArmor. You could have reports coming from, vulnerability scanners like Trivi and others. So there are community-based adapters to take all of these and offer the policy results in a standard format, which is super critical to completing that loop, because policies are one piece of your overall security puzzle. You still need other tools to complete that, right?
Yeah.
But if you put all of this together, and now when you have the standard results, the next thing we're building, and by the way, commercial vendors like my company as well as other companies, we provide these solutions on top of these open source building blocks. But even in the community, we're exploring to say, how do we at least define that mapping? How do we make it easy for anybody? And can we control that mapping as code itself, right? So why not make that a Kubernetes resource, which is in your management plane, or in the policy parlance, it would be in your policy administration point or your PAP.
Yeah.
So uh, so that would be something that's managed in a management cluster, but then all of your user clusters will ensure that they are reporting that and feeding that back so you can get the right results and compliance reports.
Right. And do you know of any people who have successfully gone through this scenario
It,
where
it's
they're actually,
so at some organizations, but very few have, right? And this is where better tooling, better projects is required. So
yeah,
there is a lot of ongoing work, and it's across companies like our company, as well as then like several other larger companies are involved in the policy working group, also in SIG security. To promote these sort of ideas and patterns. But the first thing for the last 12 to 18 months, look, I mean, maybe like 18 months ago, if you ask somebody Kubernetes policies, they're like, yeah, it has policies. What do I need to do? Right. So
yeah,
the first
yeah,
step was make sure everybody understands that. And once we have the policy building blocks, now we can get to higher level business functions, which is where the value is at. Right.
yeah.
And that's what we're super excited about.
Actually, that's a good point as well, because policies by itself don't make any sense unless they tie up to a
Right.
business function. Because how do you sell it to the, I guess, the business owner at the end of the
Yep.
day? They're the ones who are saying yes or no for a policy, whether encryption or no encryption. They're the ones who are kind of putting the foot down for it.
Yeah.
So we're finding people are finding value from that perspective as well, that they're able to link policies to business.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's very critical. Like, again, if you want to say, okay, I want, software supply chain security, right? As an example.
Yeah,
But what does that mean? It's great that an organization wants that. They want to improve their posture there, but how do you translate it into policies? How do you get back the results? And in the past, the typical thing has to be to say, okay, let's find a vendor who can do this. But that world has changed, right? Now you want more flexibility, you want more open source projects, You want things which can be, it's more pluggable with systems like Kubernetes. So that's what makes it very powerful. And there's this rise of platform engineering that goes with that, which
Yeah.
takes on the security role as well.
Right, because compliance code is an interesting one as well. Because I think a lot of people, to your point, they come up with the idea that okay, my four policies for encryption are based on my NIST 800 or whatever, and I go down the path of implementing them. Now, is this like a primarily a Kyverno concept, or is it like Kubernetes by itself natively supports this?
So no, Kubernetes doesn't support it. So you would
Right,
need a policy engine to enforce those configurations, right?
right,
And in the
right.
past, like in the early days of Kubernetes, you would have to rely on a proprietary product or tool. What
Yeah,
we've done with the policy working group and now with Kyverno, as a policy engine focused on Kubernetes, to make that a lot easier, to make it, and again, this changes per organization, right? Because just imagine, so you say, okay, I need encryption, but
yeah,
some organization may say, look, I'm already using encrypted SSDs, so I'm going to change that to meet my needs, right?
yeah,
So you need that flexibility, and in the past that just wasn't possible, but now with Kyverno you can, right? And so that's why moving those policies into declarative Kubernetes configurations, that's the innovation, and again, the game changer, right, for that Kyverno brought to the table.
and so Kubernetes can go to a level of saying it can understand if the container is encrypted or not, or signed or not as well, or is it like more to your point, that's a policy defined because it pod security cannot do this, where it can say, oh the container that I'm using is signed. It can't do that by itself. Pod security,
No, it cannot. Yeah, so you would need
right?
additional policies. So Kubernetes has all the constructs. So think of it this way, right? Kubernetes gives you, it's a toolbox. It
Yeah,
gives you all the tools, but it doesn't know what you're trying to build, right? So you have to get the blueprints, you have to understand what you're trying to build, and kind of figure that out. Now, part of that, of course, is the policy and governance. So Kubernetes gives you all of the constructs to encrypt software, to make sure through admission controllers to check for signatures or S bombs before allowing something to run. Whether
yeah,
you do it or not is up to you, right? So that a policy engine comes in, and then there's another kind of layer. This gets a little bit meta, but it's like, okay, if you're using policies across all these clusters, who's managing the policies, right? So that's where
yep.
GitOps comes in. So that and it's a very interesting, but you want to complete that full loop and get the policy reports to results, and then of course create the right business value again, which is where everybody should be focused.
Yeah, and it feels like there's a maturity curve here. If I were to put this on a scale, and people who are listening to you going, "Oh, Jim, this is so awesome! This is exciting! I want to do policy as code, compliance is code to the extreme as well. If they can convince your auditors to accept that, what do you feel is a maturity curve for something like deploying a policy engine into an organization with Kubernetes? And not, I mean, nowadays, like I've got bare metal Kubernetes, I've got managed Kubernetes, I've got like a lot of complexity there as
Yep.
well. How do you now normally see organizations do it in the conversations you've had? Where does one normally start, and how mature can someone get?
Right. Right. So you always want to crawl, walk, run, right? So you want to
Yeah,
kind of first start with your simple steps, so which get you there. So making sure every cluster has a policy engine, right? And regardless of which policy engine you choose, uh, at least get a policy engine in place. Making sure you can start managing these policies for your organization, just like you would manage Kubernetes resources, is super important, right? If you're relying on a vendor to give you the policies, you're kind of doing it a little bit wrong, right? You have to think a little broader than that. You have to make sure that you're comfortable with managing. And by the way, policies are not just for security but also for automation, and Kyverno was the first to bring that innovation into the space as well, because we trigger, like, generation of resources, mutation of resources based on policies that can be set. So
right,
that again gives you a very powerful toolbox to solve a lot of complex problems in Kubernetes, which just couldn't be done before, right? Like one simple, and this is maybe kind of spoiler alert, but one of the demos that I was still referring to at KubeCon, what one challenge is, if you're spinning up these clusters, how do you register the cluster back into your GitOps controller? And you could write another custom controller for that. if you're, if you kind of are have the knowledge of creating your Go Kubernetes controllers.
Yeah.
If you or you could you would have to kind of have some glue code or a manual handoff, right? Kyverno can fully automate that. So we're working with, and we're going to show that across Argo CD and Cluster API, and how to just make that automated end to end.
Right. Wait, what is a typical mature pipeline, for lack of a better word? Because you mentioned Argo CD and Cluster API and stuff as well.
Mhm.
What do you see? And I imagine there's a particular reason why you went down that path of, Cluster API and Argo CD and Kyverno together. Is that what a mature, like a really mature Kubernetes pipeline looks like?
It's one implementation, right? So there's the nice thing about CNCF is there's alternatives to everything. So there's Flux, which
Of
is
course. It's like
extremely
walking into a
powerful.
shopping market. Like, it's like, what kind of toothpaste you need? Mint flavored, or like,
Right.
like, I feel like it's like a shopping cart you can keep adding.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, the landscape is just, it's amazing to see how quickly it has exploded and continues to grow at a very fast clip, right? So, but yeah, just looking at, so the building blocks here are you need, some GitOps controller, and the two leading ones are Flux and Argo CD, right?
Yeah.
You need a policy engine, and the two leading ones are Kyverno and OPA, which is Open Policy Agent.
Yeah.
And then you need, if you're doing cluster provisioning on this, you have to pick your, path to how are you going to provision infrastructure. You could pick cluster API, which is supported, by the way, by the Kubernetes community itself. And every major cloud, there's about 12 to 15 different cloud providers who are now, supporting creation of clusters through that. Or you could pick a project like Crossplane, which lets you not only spin up clusters, but also infrastructure, right? Which is very powerful. So you can
Hmm.
configure AWS infrastructure in Kubernetes, or Google infrastructure, or whatever your cloud provider is, right?
Right. So, and to your point, then, well, as you go through the shopping cart channel, I guess, for lack of a better word, you pick your providers. I guess I imagine the recommendation is to think of policy first before you go down the path of CI/CD and
Absolutely.
GitOps and all of that.
Well, so, and because you also want to apply policy in your GitOps pipeline, right?
Yeah.
So, for
Yeah.
example, Flux has adopted Kyverno. It is, if you are deploying Flux, you're already using Kyverno,
Right.
for multi-tenancy and some other use cases. And we see that as a growing kind of thing, because you also want to apply certain policies in your pipeline before something even gets to admission controls, right? Because if you're doing a defense in depth kind of zero trust model, you have to check at every level. And the sooner you can give the feedback back to your developers or whoever is requesting, the application deploy or the code or the infrastructure, the better.
Right. And this is definitely fascinating for me, because also I'm just trying to think from an average person perspective, who's listening to this and understanding the complexity of Kubernetes sometimes gets really overwhelming as
Yeah.
well. And to what you mentioned, okay, I've made my choices. I've found a maturity curve that I want to stick with, and I'm going to go down the path of. Sounds like, as a team that's trying to do Kubernetes security these days, there's a lot of like, you have to learn a lot of things. Like, it almost feels like you have to understand the Argo CD, for lack of a better word, for how do you make policy for that. How do you make policies for your I guess watch the watcher, so Kyverno itself, or how, I mean,
Mhm.
if there's RBAC or whatever, and then you
Yep.
go to next level, GitOps and everything. So do you feel like, where do you see this kind of go in terms of, is the future that we're going to be primarily policy as code and compliance as code driven?
I think that's a very interesting kind of path we're on, right? So, and the goal here is not to, again, it's more to drive automation and to drive secure self-service. And I really like the combination of those words, because if you think about it, self-service is not difficult, right? I mean, you can provide self-service, but doing secure self-service is insanely difficult unless you have the right tools and the right, technologies in place. So
Yeah.
that's where we always kind of think of, and that's one of the reasons why we said for Kyverno from the beginning, look, just doing security is not enough. You need security plus automation. You have to be able to, trigger some powerful automation workflows, things like that. Combining the two is when the magic happens, right?
Yeah.
So we
Yeah. That's
believe
right.
Kyverno has that potential to simplify that, and If you adopt Kyverno across your GitOps pipelines, whether it's Flux or Argo CD, and if you adopt Kyverno as your admission controller and as your runtime scanner, you're like 80% there, right? And just with open source policies and other things, you can go from like zero to secure literally in minutes, right? Which is just fascinating in terms of what's available, the powerful tools and constructs and things that are available. Then you can step back and start customizing the policy, doing the compliance mapping. So those can be a phase two or phase three. But
Yeah.
to get started, get the policies in place, get the policy engines, and figure out what's just like, in any security realm, you would start with a threat model and say, okay, what do we want to accomplish here? Start with that and say, what are we trying to secure? Let's get the basics, and then let's get to the business value, because that's what DevSecOps is all about.
Yeah, and that's a great answer there. I think the conversation would be incomplete if we don't kind of talk about the shopping mart between like a Kyverno and Opa as well. So
Yeah,
what the open source projects? What's the difference between the two before people trying to make a choice between Opa versus Kyverno? Like
yeah,
you can talk the good and bad and the ugly, I guess, both sides.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And then, by the way, I'm, not. I like what OPA brought to the table, right? So they were the first policy engine within CNCF. And it's not like policies were a new concept. Everybody, we all understand policies and what it does. Like, even if you're doing like Active Directory, you have your group policy. We all
Yeah,
know what that is, right?
that's right. That's right.
So
Yeah,
that's not nothing new. But what OPA did was it said, okay, let's come up with a common language. They chose to go the domain DSL route, so they created their own language called Rego
yeah,
for authorization at first. But then they were saying, okay, we could have broader use cases than that. We can plug it into things like Kubernetes, and it provides value. It kind of, but before we launched Kyverno, by the way, I mean, OPA was already popular, right? And we were really debating, is there a need for another policy engine in the Kubernetes space?
yeah,
Because as a, choices are great, but like you said, it's overwhelming if you go and look at the toothpaste aisle and you see like
yeah.
a gazillion different choices. Like, where do I start? Just give me something that works and I want to move on, right?
That's
Or
right.
tell
Yeah,
me what is better.
yeah,
So the main problems we saw with OPA, which is why, and as we spoke to our customers, we spoke to the community and the CNCF, we kind of checked with a lot of folks in the CNCF before we made Kyverno a sandbox project. We have graduated already to incubation in about 15 months, which is pretty fast given the timelines.
yeah,
But there, what we heard is OPA, I understand the use cases, but Rego is not what I want to use. I don't have a team of Rego programmers. I don't want to build a team, and every time I build a team, they leave. I don't want to rely on vendors to give me these policies. I need to manage my own policies, right?
yeah, yeah,
And what we did is we stepped back and look at this, and we initially Kyverno was built as a module in Nirmata, but then we open sourced it. We said, why not leverage Kubernetes? Kubernetes is extensible, like we were just talking about. You can provision VMs, so why can't you provision policies, right?
yeah,
And why not? So whether I mean, maybe there's a camp that says, okay, Kubernetes is still way too complex, way too too much. But if you spend the time and effort to learn Kubernetes, you understand how to manage Kubernetes resources. You've invested in tooling around that.
yeah,
Use all of that for policies, right? Why come up with something foreign which you have to kind of fit in and try to deal with all that complexity? And then you're managing now policies, policy results, all of this as Kubernetes resources. It's very native. It's seamless for DevSecOps teams. And the other thing we decided is to say, look, we're not trying to we want to make Kyverno full featured. We don't want to build, both from an open source project and a business model point of view for our company, we didn't want to do something to say, hey, you have to come to us to simplify Kyverno, right? And that never scales. So we are like, look, you should be able to use Kyverno on your own, and we're happy to have you use Kyverno on your own. And we want to give you as many policies as possible, right? So, and the
yeah,
community has been fantastic in contributing and growing that, right? One thing we're very proud of in the Kyverno community, compared to other communities where you see a lot of vendors but very few end users, our
yeah,
contributors are end users. right? So you're like, this is awesome, right? Because it's
Yeah.
the actual users who are driving our roadmap, who are driving the policies. And of course it comes with, so we hear the feedback very quickly. If there's a single, challenge in Kyverno, we will hear it, right? Because it's in so many production clusters, running at scale, that all of these things becomes very critical. But going back to the main differences, so it's that policy language. Kyverno is kind of, you can think of it as a no code for policies, right?
Yeah.
Although you can manage those as declarative resources and apply all the policy as good. There's no other language to learn. The
Right.
second thing is reports and policy results. It's meant for DevSecOps. So you don't have to go to some external tool or some other way of finding these results. They are
Right.
very much geared towards, your developers to see that results and to understand how to deal with that.
Yeah.
And the third thing I'll point out is that security plus automation. So OPA can only do the validation and checks. It cannot do any of the automation. So you are left on your own to kind of do that automation, which we believe is the missing piece, in getting to a higher level of, policy as code, security as code, compliance as code.
I think that's a great explanation, and Rego definitely has its challenges. From what if you kind of ever go on the social media world, you probably hear a lot of people complain about Rego as well. So all the power to people who learn Rego, nothing wrong with that. But if there's an easier option, maybe you want to walk down that path as well.
Absolutely.
Another question that I get quite often is the difference between Kyverno and Gatekeeper,
Yeah.
and we kind of touched on this, but like if you know a quick brief version of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So open policy agent is the engine which kind of provides Rego, right?
Yeah.
But Gatekeeper is the admission controller, which also includes Open Policy Agent, and is able to apply those policies at admission controls in Kubernetes, right?
Yeah.
So Kyverno, it's a single project. You don't need Gatekeeper plus Open Policy Agent, and it even runs, by the way, as a command line, so you can run it outside your clusters and apply policies in your CI/CD pipeline. It's just one project, one tool. But that's the role of Gatekeeper, is to bring OPA into Kubernetes. It also defines some constraints and other things on top, which you can manage as Kubernetes resources, but ultimately your policies have to be written in Rego.
Oh, right. And so this is kind of where the admission control we spoke about that is already there in Kubernetes that maps well with Kyverno. So Kyverno is working with admission controller from Kubernetes, is that right?
Yes. So Kyverno operates as an admission controller. It receives every API request. So if you download and install Kyverno, it self-registers with the API server as an admission controller. It receives every API request as a webhook, both for
Yeah.
validation as well as mutation. And then it applies your configured policy set to those API requests.
Right. Okay. Sweet. Now that's pretty much it. I think where do people, because I feel like the more we talk about this, more there are depths of complexity to each of them. I mean, we kind of briefly touched on a lot of topics, but there's a lot of depth to a lot of those topics as well. Where do you normally recommend people start with policy management and start learning about it? Because it sounds like a very complex topic as well.
It can be, but hopefully with all the work going on in the community as well as through other ecosystem partners, we're making this easier and easier to operate and manage at scale. So
Yeah.
certainly to start with, Kyverno.io is our kind of one-stop shop for the project. There's links on there to join the community. You typically hang out on the Kubernetes Slack, right? So that's where you can come ask questions, get started with Kyverno. There's also the policy working group within the Kubernetes and CNCF community. So certainly, if you're interested in policy or just want to kind of talk about how to use it, that's the right place to come to. And there's also Nirmata, right? So like companies like us and other vendors who are providing commercial tool solutions to kind of complete the picture for enterprises.
Awesome. No, that's kind of, thank you for that sharing that, and that's kind of what I had in terms of like the technical questions. I've got three questions in here, which are fun questions. This is like towards the tail end of the section, just to get to know you, Jim, as a person, beyond the Kubernetes and Kyverno world.
Okay.
Not too complex questions. It's more like, so the first one being, what do you spend most time on when you're not working on Kyverno or anything which is Kubernetes, I guess?
So yeah, it's mostly these days with the community and with other things. There's so many interesting things to keep up with. So definitely most of my time goes there, but certainly hanging out with family, friends. I like watching movies, so typically weekend is I'll kind of binge watch a few movies over the weekend. Yeah.
Fair enough. But for people interested, Black Adam is about to come out as well, so they should watch that. So the second question being, what is something that you're proud of but is not on your social media?
Hmm. Oh, several things, right? So of course, like I have two boys, and it's certainly the type of things they end up doing, and it's always interesting, right? Because you see this with your parents, but then as you once you have kids and as you see watch them growing up, it's like they're gonna far exceed anything that we have been able to accomplish in our
Yeah,
generation, right? So watching
yeah,
that probably is the proudest thing. Yeah.
that's pretty awesome. A great answer as well. So last question: what's your favorite cuisine or restaurant that you can share?
Oh, I love Greek food, and so I mentioned I went to University of Illinois, which is right next to Greek Town in Chicago. If folks are
Right,
familiar with that area, so certainly I think there's lots of good. There was one restaurant called Parthenon there, which we used to always go hang out at. That it,
right. I should
yeah,
check out. I didn't realize Chicago had like a big Greek influence.
oh yeah, tremendous, yeah,
Right. Okay. Well, in spite of the cold, because I thought Greek, I just imagined Greek to be like very
to
Mediterranean
be
salads
right,
and
right, right.
everything. But
Yeah,
Chicago
no,
is
it's
actually not the extreme that I would have expected the Greeks to go.
yeah. But there's a very very strong, like most of the, yeah, like the downtown area, there's a nice Greek town. There's of course several other
Of course,
cuisines
yeah,
and cultures there too, but
yeah. But the Greek one stood out for you.
yeah.
Well, awesome. Well, that's pretty much what we had time for, man. Thanks so much for coming in. And where can people find you, by the way, and Nirmata as well?
Yeah, so jim@nirmata.com is my email, so pretty easy to get to, or Jim Bugwadia on Twitter, or any of the Kubernetes or CNCF Slack channels, and would love to hear from folks on where they would like to see some of these technologies and tools go.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. I think I'm taking away compliance is scored as my biggest takeaway from this. That actually people who want to achieve that and want to upskill in that, this is definitely a path forward. But I really appreciate you coming on board, talking about Kyverno and sharing why there's a need for us to talk about policy. Maybe not the first thing in the morning, but definitely something they should probably consider talking more about as well. But I really appreciate this. Thank you so much for coming in, man. I appreciate that.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Vineet, as well. Thanks, everyone who was tuned in online. We'll see you in the next episode on the Cloud Security Podcast. See you soon.